Who were the Rephaim? The Bible mentions them many times, yet very few people today know who they really were. Sometimes they are described as giants. Sometimes they are remembered as mighty warriors of the ancient land. But who actually were they? This is where the mystery begins. Unlike famous figures such as Goliath or King Og of Bashan, the Rephaim are not just one man, but a group that appears across many books of the Bible. They are mentioned in Genesis, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Isaiah, Proverbs, and the Psalms. That spread alone should make us pause. The fact that writers of different centuries still remembered them suggests that the Rephaim had an important place in Israel's memory of its past. Let's begin at the very first mention. In Genesis 14:5, the Rephaim appear in a list of peoples defeated by Chedorlaomer, a Mesopotamian king, and his allies. Alongside the Zuzim, Emim, and Horites, the Rephaim are placed in the region of Ashtaroth Karnaim, east of the Jordan River. That's already significant. The story is set in the time of Abraham, very early in Israel's narrative. And here, the Rephaim are not presented as legends or myths. They are treated as just another people living in a specific place, defeated in a war, and part of the geography of the land. This points to the Rephaim being understood originally as a historical group, not a symbolic one. But who were they exactly? The Bible itself gives us some clues. In Deuteronomy 2, Moses recalls how different nations had encountered and displaced groups of giants. Verse 11 says, "They were also regarded as Rephaim, like the Anakim, but the Moabites called them Emim." Later in verse 20, the Ammonites are said to have called them Zamzumim. What does that tell us? That multiple nations in the region had their own names for the same group. Israel called them Rephaim, Moab called them Emim, Ammon called them Zamzumim. And all of these names carried the idea of a people who were unusually tall, strong, or fearsome. This is important because it suggests that the memory of the Rephaim was not unique to Israel. Neighboring cultures also had traditions about them, which adds weight to the idea that they were real people, not simply a biblical invention. Now let's consider the most famous individual associated with the Rephaim, King Og of Bashan. In Deuteronomy 3:11 it says, "Only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. His bed was made of iron, and was more than 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide." In modern terms, that's about 13 feet by 6 feet. Some argue that this proves Og himself was gigantic. Others suggest that the description of his bed might have been symbolic, or even a reference to a large ceremonial sarcophagus. Either way, the detail is striking. Og was remembered as the last of a line of powerful rulers connected with the Rephaim, and his name lived on as an example of their might. From a historical perspective, Og's territory, Bashan, is also worth examining. Bashan was in the Golan Heights region, an area full of ancient megalithic structures, stone circles, and dolmens. One famous site is Rujem El Hiri, a massive stone circle dated to the 3rd millennium BC. While the Bible never directly links these structures to the Rephaim, later Jewish and local traditions often associated the mysterious stone monuments of Bashan with giants of old. Archaeology cannot prove that the Rephaim built them, but it does show that the land remembered in their stories was indeed filled with ancient and impressive remains. Let's return to the biblical text. The book of Joshua also records the Rephaim. In Joshua 12:4 and 13:12, their land is described as part of the conquered territories. The valley of Rephaim, southwest of Jerusalem, became a place name still remembered in the days of King David. This shows that even after the Rephaim themselves had disappeared, the memory of them lingered in geography. When someone said, "Valley of Rephaim," they were recalling a time when these ancient people had lived and fought in the land. Place names, as historians often remind us, are like fossils of memory. They preserve hints of the past long after the people themselves are gone. So what do we see so far? We see that the Rephaim appear early in Genesis as a people living east of the Jordan. We see that Israel, Moab, and Ammon all had traditions of them, though under different names. We see that King Og of Bashan was remembered as their final remnant, with his enormous bed as proof of their unusual stature. And we see that even the geography of Canaan preserved their name in valleys and regions. All of this suggests that the Rephaim were not invented. They were remembered as a real people, though over time their memory became larger, stranger, and in some texts more spiritual. This brings us to an important point. In later biblical passages, the word Rephaim no longer refers only to giants of flesh and blood. In books like Isaiah 14:9, Proverbs 9:18, and Psalms 88:10, Rephaim is used to mean the dead, the shades, or the spirits in Sheol. How did this shift happen? Many scholars believe that the memory of the Rephaim as ancient mighty ones blended into Israel's language for the underworld. Just as ancient warriors became ancestors in memory, so too the word for them became a way of speaking about the dead. In this sense, the Rephaim represent both the past people of the land and the departed spirits who live in the shadowy world of Sheol. To sum up the first part of our journey, the Rephaim were an ancient people remembered by many nations as giants or mighty warriors. The Bible places them in specific lands: Ashtaroth, Bashan, the valley of Rephaim. They were connected to King Og, remembered for his massive bed, and they were associated with other tribes like the Anakim, Emim, and Zamzumim. Their memory was strong enough that even when the people were gone, their name lived on in geography, and eventually in Israel's language for the dead. And this leads us to a set of questions that will guide the rest of the video. Were the Rephaim truly giants, or were they simply remembered as tall and strong warriors in comparison to the smaller populations around them? Were they related to the Nephilim of Genesis 6, as some traditions suggest, or were they an entirely different people? And why did the memory of the Rephaim shift from being about flesh and blood humans to being about spirits in the underworld? These are the mysteries we'll explore as we move deeper into the history and the legacy of the Rephaim. When we move into the book of Deuteronomy, the Rephaim take on an even clearer shape. This is because Deuteronomy is written as a kind of reflection. Moses is addressing the people of Israel just before they enter the Promised Land, and he recounts the history of the nations they encountered along the way. In doing so, he gives us some of the most detailed information about the Rephaim and related groups. In Deuteronomy 2, we hear about how Israel's neighbors, the Moabites and the Ammonites, had once faced nations of giants themselves. Moses says in verse 10, "The Emim formerly lived there, a people great and many and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim." Then, in verse 20, speaking about the land of the Ammonites, he adds, "That too is counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzumim, a people great and many, tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and they dispossessed them and settled in their place." These verses are crucial because they show that the Rephaim were not simply a name that Israel used. They were remembered under different names by other nations as well. The Moabites called them Emim, the Ammonites called them Zamzumim, the Israelites called them Rephaim. All three traditions agree on 2 points: that these were ancient peoples and that they were considered unusually tall and strong. In other words, the memory of the Rephaim was regional, not just local. That strengthens the historical basis for their existence. If multiple cultures in the same area recall a similar people, it suggests that there really was a group that stood out in the past. It's also worth noticing the way Deuteronomy frames this history. The message Moses gives is not simply about giants. It is about how nations rise and fall. The Moabites displaced the Emim, the Ammonites displaced the Zamzumim, and Israel would now displace the Canaanite tribes. By linking the Rephaim to these other nations, Deuteronomy shows a pattern. Powerful peoples once lived in the land, but over time they were removed. Their size and strength did not guarantee their survival. This was an important theological lesson for Israel, that the land belonged to God, not to the mighty ones of the past. But Deuteronomy also gives us one of the most famous figures associated with the Rephaim, Og, King of Bashan. In Deuteronomy 3:11, the text reads, "For only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. That's about 13 feet long and 6 feet wide in modern terms. This verse has captured people's imagination for centuries. Was Og really so large that he needed a bed that size? Some scholars argue that the word translated as bed could also mean sarcophagus. If that is the case, the verse might be referring to a large stone coffin kept as a relic in Rabbah. If it was truly a bed, then it might have been a ceremonial object rather than an everyday piece of furniture. Still, the fact that the text emphasizes its size tells us how Og was remembered. As a man of extraordinary proportions, the last survivor of a race that people thought of as giants. The territory of Og is also telling. Bashan, his kingdom, was in the northern part of ancient Israel near the Golan Heights. This region is rich with ancient remains, dolmens, burial sites, and massive stone structures that go back thousands of years before Israel's time. Later Jewish tradition connected some of these structures to the Rephaim, seeing them as monuments left behind by giants. While archaeology cannot prove that, it does show that Bashan was a place where older, mysterious ruins dominated the landscape. For people in biblical times, these ruins may have seemed like natural evidence of an earlier race of powerful beings. In Deuteronomy, Og is described as the last of the Rephaim. That phrase is important. It suggests that by the time of Israel's conquest, the Rephaim as a group were already gone. Only Og remained, a kind of living relic of the past, and even he would be defeated by Israel, as the text records in Deuteronomy 3:3, where Moses says that Israel struck Og, his sons, and all his people until no survivor was left. The story shows the passing of one era into another. The age of the giants, the Rephaim, was over, and Israel's age was beginning. What do we learn from all this? Historically, the Rephaim seem to have been remembered as one of several peoples who were both physically impressive and politically significant in the land before Israel settled there. Their memory survived not only in Israel's texts, but also in the traditions of Moab and Ammon. By the time Deuteronomy was written, the Rephaim were no longer a living people, but a memory of a people who had once lived in the land. Their last great representative, Og, stood as a symbol of a past that was being swept away. And here we come to an interesting question. Why would the biblical writers take such care to record the size of Og's bed, or to recall the alternate names for the Rephaim among other nations? One reason may be historical accuracy. By including details that linked Israel's story to the memories of other peoples, the text anchored Israel's past in the shared memory of the region. Another reason may be theological. By recalling these mighty ones of the past, the story emphasized that strength, size, and even ancient heritage could not stand against God's will. So far then, the picture is becoming clearer. The Rephaim were remembered as an ancient people of unusual stature. They were connected to the Emim, the Zamzumim, and the Anakim. Their last representative was Og, remembered for his giant bed and his rule over Bashan. By the time Israel entered the land, they were already fading into history. Yet their memory was strong enough that the biblical writers saw them as a significant part of the story of Israel's inheritance of Canaan. This raises further questions. How exactly were the Rephaim connected to the other giant groups mentioned in the Bible? Were they descendants of the Nephilim of Genesis 6, as some traditions suggest? Or were they simply one of many peoples remembered for their size and strength, later grouped together under the label of giants? And what do we make of the way the word Rephaim gradually shifted in meaning, from living giants to the spirits of the dead? These questions lead us naturally to the next stage of the story, the lands of the Rephaim, and the way their presence was remembered in Israel's geography and archaeology. One of the most revealing ways to understand the Rephaim is through the land they were said to inhabit. The Bible does not treat them as vague myths, but places them in specific regions. These geographic references give us important clues about who they were and how their memory was preserved. The first major location connected to the Rephaim is Bashan, the kingdom of King Og. As we saw earlier in Deuteronomy, Og was remembered as the last of the Rephaim. His territory stretched across what we now call the Golan Heights, a fertile plateau with volcanic soil, rich pasture, and high strategic value. In the biblical narrative, Bashan was a land of fortified cities. Deuteronomy 3:14-5 says that Israel captured 60 cities in the region of Argob in Og's kingdom, all with high walls, gates, and bars. This description paints Bashan as a land of strength and security, further reinforcing its association with mighty rulers like Og. But Bashan is also remarkable for another reason: its ancient ruins. Archaeologists have long noted the presence of megalithic structures in the region. Thousands of dolmens, large stone tombs, dot the landscape, dating back to the 3rd millennium BC, long before Israel's arrival. One of the most famous sites is Rujm el-Hiri, also known as Gilgal Rephaim in Hebrew, meaning Circle of the Rephaim. It is a massive stone circle made of over 40,000 basalt rocks arranged in concentric rings, with a central mound. Scholars debate its purpose, but it is generally dated to around 3000 BC. The fact that later Hebrew tradition associated this site with the Rephaim shows how physical landmarks became tied to the memory of these ancient people. While archaeology cannot prove that the Rephaim built Rujm el-Hiri, the sheer scale of the monument made it a natural candidate for connection with legendary giants. Another important location is the Valley of Rephaim, just southwest of Jerusalem. This valley appears in the biblical narrative during the time of King David. In 2 Samuel 5:18, we read that the Philistines came and spread out in the Valley of Rephaim to challenge David. The valley is mentioned again in verses 22 and 25 as a place of repeated battles. Why was it called the Valley of Rephaim? Most likely because in earlier times it had been associated with the Rephaim people. By the time of David, the Rephaim were long gone, but the place name preserved their memory. This is significant because it shows that even in the heart of Israel's land, there were echoes of earlier inhabitants remembered as giants. The Valley of Rephaim also appears in later books as a symbolic location. In Isaiah 17:5, it is mentioned in a description of harvest, showing that the name remained in common use long after the original people were forgotten. Place names are one of the strongest pieces of evidence we have for the Rephaim's historical reality. While people may debate their size or their exact identity, the fact that their name became attached to multiple regions suggests that they were remembered across a wide area. In addition to Bashan and the Valley of Rephaim, the Bible links the Rephaim to other lands east of the Jordan River. Genesis 14:5 placed them in Ashtaroth Karnaim, a city in Bashan. Deuteronomy 2 connected them to territories once held by the Moabites and Ammonites, where they were called Emim and Zamzumim. Joshua 13:12 again ties them to Bashan, noting that their land was taken and given to the half-tribe of Manasseh. Altogether, these references form a map. The Rephaim are consistently associated with fertile, strategic lands in the Transjordan and with valleys and regions in Canaan proper. What is also striking is how these areas often contain archaeological remains that are impressive even by today's standards. The dolmens of the Golan, the stone circles, the fortified cities, these are the kinds of monuments that naturally invite legends. For people in the biblical period looking at such ancient structures without knowing who built them, it made sense to attribute them to earlier mighty ones. This is a common pattern in human history. Across the world, when later cultures encounter monumental remains they cannot explain, they often attribute them to giants or gods. The memory of the Rephaim fits into this pattern. Historically speaking, then, the Rephaim may not have been giants in the literal sense of towering over everyone else. Instead, they may have been a powerful group remembered for their strength and associated with monumental sites. Over time, their name became tied to geography and eventually to legend. By the time of David, they were no longer present, but their memories shaped the way people thought about certain places. Another point to consider is the way biblical authors use geography to connect the past with the present. By naming valleys and lands after the Rephaim, they created a living reminder of the contrast between the mighty peoples of the past and Israel's present claim to the land. The memory of the Rephaim was not just about history, it was about identity. For Israel, remembering that God had given them victory over lands once inhabited by such mighty ones was a way of reinforcing their trust in God's power. So when we look at the lands of the Rephaim, we see more than just geography. We see how memory, archaeology, and theology overlap. We see how ancient ruins became tied to stories of giants. And we see how place names preserved the memory of a people long after they had disappeared. Up to this point, we've seen the Rephaim described as a people of the land, tall, strong, and linked to places like Bashan and the valley of Rephaim. But in later biblical texts, the word Rephaim begins to mean something very different. Instead of describing living warriors or tribes, it comes to refer to the shades of the dead, the silent spirits who dwell in Sheol, the underworld. This shift is one of the most fascinating parts of the story, because it shows how memory and language evolve over time. We first see this change in books like Isaiah, Psalms, and Proverbs. For example, in Isaiah 14:9, the prophet speaks of the fall of the king of Babylon and says, "Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades, Rephaim, to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations." Here the word Rephaim does not mean giants on earth. It means the spirits of dead kings, the great ones of the past now reduced to shadows in the underworld. We see the same use in the Psalms. Psalm 88:10 says, "Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the departed Rephaim rise up to praise you?" Once again, Rephaim is used as a term for the dead, not for living peoples. Similarly, Proverbs 9:18, in describing the danger of folly, warns that those who fall into her trap do not know that the dead, Rephaim, are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. What is happening here? How did a word that once described a powerful people in the land become a word for the spirits of the dead? Scholars suggest a few explanations. One possibility is that the Rephaim, as remembered ancestors of the land, gradually became associated with the underworld. In the ancient Near East, it was common for the mighty ones of the past to be linked with the realm of the dead. For example, in Ugaritic texts from Canaan, there are references to the Rephaim, a group of ancestral spirits who dwell in the underworld and receive offerings. The similarity between the Ugaritic Rephaim and the Hebrew Rephaim is striking. It suggests that the Israelites inherited or adapted this broader cultural tradition. In Canaanite belief, the Rephaim were semi-divine dead kings who could still influence the living. In Israel's tradition, the Rephaim became simply the shades in Sheol, stripped of divine power, but still remembered as the great ones of old. This connection to Ugaritic literature is especially important. The Ugaritic texts, discovered in the 20th century at Ras Shamra in modern Syria, date to around the 14th century BC. They show us that the concept of the Rephaim, mighty ancestral spirits, was part of the cultural background of the region, long before the Israelites wrote their scriptures. The Hebrew Bible's use of Rephaim to mean the dead likely reflects this shared cultural memory. It's a reminder that Israel's language and thought did not exist in isolation, but interacted with the wider world of the ancient Near East. So in one sense, the Rephaim are remembered historically as tall and powerful people in the land. In another sense, in later texts, they are remembered spiritually as the dead. These two meanings are not necessarily contradictory. Rather, they reflect different stages in how memory works. A once living people, long gone, became remembered as the archetypal dead. In other words, the Rephaim passed from history into legend, and from legend into theology. This dual meaning is also significant theologically. In Israel's faith, Sheol was the place of the dead, silent, shadowy, cut off from the living. By using the name Rephaim for its inhabitants, the biblical writers may have been emphasizing that even the greatest of the mighty ones eventually end up there. The leaders, the kings, the giants of old, all of them become silent shades in Sheol. No matter how powerful someone is in life, death reduces them to the same shadowy existence. This fits with the broader biblical theme that human pride and strength cannot escape mortality. The shift in meaning also helps explain why later readers sometimes struggle to understand who exactly the Rephaim were. Were they giants? Were they spirits? The answer is both, depending on the context. In the early historical books, they were described as living peoples. In the poetic and prophetic books, they were the dead in Sheol. The evolution of the word reflects the way Israel's memory of the past was shaped by both history and cultural influence. It's important to stress here that this shift does not mean the Bible is confused. Rather, it shows how words can carry layers of meaning. Just as in English, we might use the word giant, both for someone physically tall and for someone who is a great figure in history. So too the word Rephaim could move from describing physical might to describing the mighty dead. Language is flexible, and in the Bible it often carries traces of older traditions reshaped into new meanings. From a historical perspective, this transition tells us something valuable. It shows that the Rephaim were not forgotten quickly. Their memory lasted long enough that their name became a general term for the dead. That in itself is remarkable. Most ancient peoples fade completely from memory. The fact that the Rephaim's name survived, even if transformed, speaks to the impression they left on the cultures around them. By now we have seen how the Rephaim appear in the Bible both as a remembered people of unusual stature and, in later texts, as the silent shades of the underworld. But how do historians, linguists, and archaeologists approach this topic today? What can we say with confidence about the Rephaim, and where do the questions remain open? The first point that scholars emphasize is that the word Rephaim itself is complex. In the Hebrew Bible, it is applied in different ways depending on the book. In the historical narratives like Genesis, Deuteronomy, and Joshua, the Rephaim are described as a people who once lived in the land. In the poetic and prophetic writings like Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah, the term means the dead in Sheol. This dual usage is important because it shows that the term carried more than one meaning, and those meanings likely developed over time. Most scholars agree that the historical sense is older, while the theological sense reflects later development under the influence of wider Near Eastern traditions. From a linguistic perspective, the Hebrew Rephaim is very close to the Ugaritic word Archaeological, which appears in texts from the city of Ugarit, dated to around the 14th century BC. The Rephaim in those texts are ancestral spirits, often linked with kings of old, who dwell in the underworld. They receive offerings and are sometimes called upon in rituals. This connection strongly suggests that the biblical Rephaim are related to a broader cultural idea in the ancient Near East, the memory of mighty ancestors who, once dead, were thought to exist in the shadowy realm beneath the earth. The Israelites adapted this tradition, but they stripped it of ritual practices like ancestor worship, which the Bible consistently rejects. Instead, they used the word simply as a description for the powerless dead in Sheol. This shows both continuity with regional traditions and a distinct theological perspective. When it comes to archaeology, things become more challenging. To date, there is no direct physical evidence, no bones, inscriptions, or artifacts that can be conclusively identified as belonging to the Rephaim as described in the Bible. What we do have, however, are geographic and cultural traces that connect with their memory. For example, the Golan Heights region, remembered as the land of Og and the Rephaim, is filled with megalithic structures. Thousands of dolmens, large stone tombs made of massive slabs, are scattered across the landscape, along with monumental sites like Rujim el-Hiri, also called Gilgal Rephaim. These structures are impressive and ancient, dating back nearly 1,000 years before Israel entered the land. While archaeologists do not link them directly to the biblical Rephaim, later traditions naturally connected these mysterious monuments to the idea of giants or mighty ancestors. Place names also provide indirect evidence. The Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem, the city of Ashtaroth in Bashan, and other sites associated with them show that the memory of the Rephaim was tied to real geography. Place names are often some of the most durable elements of memory, surviving long after the people themselves disappear. In this case, they preserve the impression that the Rephaim were once considered significant inhabitants of the land. Scholars are divided on whether the Rephaim should be understood as a literal ethnic group or as a literary construct. Those who view them historically argue that the Rephaim may have been a group of tall, or militarily powerful people whose memory endured, much like how the Anakim were remembered. The references in Deuteronomy to the Moabites calling them Emim and the Ammonites calling them Zamzumim suggest that multiple peoples in the region recalled the same group under different names, strengthening the case for a historical reality. On the other hand, some scholars argue that the Rephaim function more as a symbolic category in the biblical text than as a precise historical tribe. In this view, they represent the archetype of the mighty ones of old, a way of expressing the idea that the land was once inhabited by formidable peoples before Israel inherited it. From this perspective, the figure of Og of Bashan might be understood less as a literal survivor of a race of giants, and more as a narrative device representing the last echo of an older, more powerful age. Another layer of debate concerns the height of the Rephaim. Were they literally giants in physical terms, or were they simply tall and strong by comparison to their neighbors? The description of Og's iron bed being 13 feet long has fueled speculation for centuries. Some scholars suggest it was symbolic, meant to emphasize his status rather than his actual body size. Others note that people in the Late Bronze Age and Iron Age were generally shorter than modern populations, with average male heights closer to 5'4" or 5'6". In that context, a person who was 6'6" or taller might have seemed like a giant, even if not extraordinary by modern standards. This explanation accounts for the language of giants, without requiring us to imagine individuals of mythical proportions. One of the more intriguing aspects of the discussion is how archaeology and memory interact. For the Israelites, seeing the massive stone tombs of Bashan and the Golan may have reinforced the stories they had heard about ancient mighty ones. Without knowledge of who had actually built them, it was natural to attribute them to the Rephaim. This process of connecting visible ancient remains to remembered traditions is common across cultures. For example, in Greece, massive Mycenaean ruins were later thought to have been built by Cyclopes, because no ordinary humans could have moved such stones. In the same way, the dolmens and stone circles of Bashan likely reinforced Israel's belief that the Rephaim were extraordinary beings of the past. The story of the Rephaim is unusual in the Bible. Unlike Israel's great enemies such as Egypt or Babylon, the Rephaim are not described as a nation with long histories or detailed lineages. They appear more like fragments of memory, scattered across different books linked to certain places and remembered for their size and strength. And yet, despite their fragmentary nature, their legacy is remarkable. They survived in Israel's memory as both a historical people and as a symbol of the dead. That dual legacy tells us a great deal about how ancient cultures remembered their past and how the Bible preserved those memories. The first part of their legacy lies in geography. The names of places kept the Rephaim alive long after they had disappeared. The Valley of Rephaim near Jerusalem remained a familiar landmark in the days of King David. Bashan, the land of Og, was remembered as a region once ruled by the last of the Rephaim. Ashtaroth, a city associated with them, continued to appear in biblical texts. Place names act like silent witnesses. They carry history forward even when people forget the details. In this way, the Rephaim left their mark on the land of Israel itself. The second part of their legacy lies in theology. The shift in meaning from giants to spirits of the dead transformed the Rephaim from an ethnic group into a symbol. In the Psalms, Proverbs, and Isaiah, the word became shorthand for the powerless dead in Sheol. This theological use carried a strong message. Even the mighty ones of old, those who once seemed invincible, now lay in silence. No power, no size, no military strength could protect them from death. In this way, the Rephaim became an example of the biblical theme that all human power is limited, and that in the end, death reduces everyone to the same state. A third part of their legacy lies in cultural memory. When we compare the biblical Rephaim with the Ugaritic RPUM, and with traditions of ancestral spirits in the wider Near East, we see that Israel was part of a shared cultural environment. The idea of mighty ancestors who became shades in the underworld was widespread. Israel, however, reshaped that idea. Where other cultures might have honored the dead with offerings, Israel consistently rejected ancestor worship. By using the term Rephaim for the dead in Sheol, the biblical writers acknowledged the cultural memory, but placed it firmly under Israel's theology of one God. In this way, the Rephaim became part of a broader dialogue between Israel's faith and its cultural surroundings. From a historical perspective, the Rephaim also illustrate how memory outlasts evidence. Archaeology cannot give us direct proof of the Rephaim as described in the Bible. No skeletons or inscriptions bear their name in a way that can be tied conclusively to them. Yet their memory endured in texts, place names, and traditions. This is common in ancient history. Many peoples leave behind little physical evidence but survive in the memory of others. The Rephaim stand as an example of how history is not only recorded in material remains, but also carried in stories, language, and geography. Their legacy also lives on in modern thought. The phrase Valley of Rephaim still echoes in discussions of biblical geography. Archaeological sites like Rujmel Hiri, sometimes called Gilgal Rephaim, attract study and speculation. Scholars debate whether the Rephaim were connected to the Nephilim of Genesis 6 or to other giant traditions in the Bible. In popular culture, the idea of the Rephaim as giants continues to capture imagination, even though the historical reality was probably less extraordinary in physical terms. The persistence of the Rephaim in both scholarship and imagination shows the enduring fascination with the borderland between history and legend. So what is the legacy of the Rephaim in the end? It is a legacy of mystery and memory. Historically, they were remembered as a strong people who lived in the land before Israel. Theologically, they became a symbol of mortality, the shades in Sheol. Culturally, they connected Israel's memory with the wider traditions of the Near East. And geographically, they left their mark on the land through valleys and regions that still bore their name. Perhaps the most important lesson from the Rephaim is how they embody the way ancient peoples thought about the past. They remind us that history is never only about facts. It is also about memory, interpretation, and meaning. The Rephaim were more than just a people who once lived in Canaan. They became a way of expressing the idea that even the greatest of the mighty eventually fade, that human power is temporary, and that only God's purposes endure. And so the Rephaim remain with us, not as bones in the ground, not as ruins we can measure, but as echoes in the biblical text, preserved in language, geography, and tradition. Their story challenges us to think about how we remember the past, how we give meaning to those who came before us, and how even the mightiest legacies eventually pass into silence.